Hello and welcome to Zero Cool Gaming and today's anime review. Today we're going to be reviewing an anime called Vampire Hunter D and Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust. They are two movies that are literally a continuation of the other. This story is a very interesting story set in a dark age of vampires, where humans live in subservient to the vampire race. But this was not always so. You see, at one time, vampires took great pride in working with the human race in order to achieve the great technologies that they once had. But in time, vampires became decadent, and vampires' pride turned and became depraved. And as such, the vampires themselves became depraved and started looking upon the humans as mere vessels to which to rule over, mere vessels for which to ease their lives. This was never the intent. But of course, time does change. The story starts with a young girl hunting on the lands near her home, where she is attacked by a werewolf. Not killed, but it removes the cross from her neck. Shortly thereafter, she is confronted by a vampire, the vampire which rules the lands in which she lives upon. Upon viewing this woman, the vampire believes that he has the right to take her against her will and force her to become his new wife, and thus he bites her, marking her as his new bride-to-be. Fearful for her future, she sends out word in need of a vampire hunter. And while she is walking the road one day, a lone traveler comes upon her, and she attacks him without knowing who he was. She of course loses this battle, and upon losing the battle she begs this traveler to help her, for she has been bitten and marked by the ruler of the lands as to be his new wife. And of course that traveler was our protagonist, the Vampire Hunter D himself. Upon seeing this mark on her neck, he informs her that the only way to remove the curse of the vampire is to kill the one who has bitten her, and he agrees to help her in this endeavor. Shortly after, great battles ensue, which Dee barely escapes with his own life. He even meets the daughter of this great vampire, in which he informs her that she herself is a vampire, a half-vampire, half-human, a half-breed, you could say, and she is disgusted by this truth, but knows it to be true herself. She has been raised to be a noble, you see, by this decadent vampire that is her father, and she has taken great pride in that nobility. But it has corrupted her to believe that she is better than the humans for which she rules over. And this is something that she cannot live with, because she knows that Dee will destroy her father, and if he succeeds in doing so, her life of nobility will cease to exist, and she wishes not to live in that world. So the battles continue, and Dee finally confronts this vampire and of course defeats him. And upon doing so, the land returns to that which it was long before this vampire ever existed, and corrupted the lands into a form of eternal darkness. And that is the end of Vampire Hunter D. In the next story, once again, a girl is taken from her family by a vampire, and Dee is led to believe that this vampire has kidnapped this girl against her will and wishes to make her his wife. D being the prideful man he is, wanting to clear the tarnish of these decadent vampires, the tarnish on his pride that he feels, decides to go after this vampire with all the zealotry and anger within him. Upon finally confronting him, he realizes that this woman did not leave her home by being kidnapped by this vampire, but actually left by her will alone. She chose to become this vampire's wife and live along beside him. The more he learns of this vampire, the more he realizes that this vampire is not a decadent vampire, but is an honorable and prideful vampire, much like himself, and believes in the old ways, not in the ways of ruling over the humans that reside on their lands, but believes of living in peace with them, and even trying to restore the once honorable vampire race to its nobility that it had once had with such pride and honor. Of course, this vampire is taken in by the evils and promises of a very decadent and deceitful vampire named Carmilla. Now, Carmilla has only one wish, one desire. You see, long ago, Dee's father had destroyed her body, but not her soul, and her soul still resided within the realm in which she had created. And she had convinced this new vampire that by coming to her lands, she would be able to grant him access to one of the great technologies of the ancient vampire race, a spaceship for which he and his bride could climb aboard and blast off into the great darkness of the never-ending space. Enticed by this promise, he goes to her lands and enters her castle, not knowing the travesty that awaits. Carmilla seduces and then kills his wife to be, and tries to kill this vampire as well. Failed she did, but tried she also did. Dee, upon realizing the travesty that occurred and his inability to save this young woman from the clutches of this vampire, decides that he will use the powers that were given to him by his father to enter the spirit realm and end her rule for good. And so he does. And he does end her spiritual form as well, before she can use the powers gained by the vampire she once tried to slay, to resurrect her body as well as her soul into one being once again. And of course, upon realizing the sword for which he wielded was the same sword that his father once wielded, terrified as she is powerless to do anything against it, and her soul is vanquished and destroyed ever eternally. And once again, just as in the prior, her realms are returned to that which they were before she had ruled over them. The vampire she tried to kill, well, he finds his dead lover and takes her body aboard that ship for which he was promised, and he starts it up and blasts into the stars above, into the great void of darkness where they will forever live in darkness together. He, upon seeing this, also believes that there is hope to restoring the honor and pride of the great vampire race, and we will continue his endeavor to do so. Years later, we see Dee standing over the grave of a human, and a young girl walks up to him. Looking upon his image, she realizes that Dee is, in fact, the same vampire that once helped her grandmother years ago, and informs him that his grandmother had always spoken well of him, even though he was a vampire. And upon hearing this, Dee realizes that yes, his works, his endeavors are making a difference, and the humans are starting to change their beliefs on the vampires themselves, and no longer fear them as they once did, and see D himself as a great, noble, prideful vampire as they once were long ago. Well, that's my rant for the day, and I hope you enjoy the rest of yours. So what is it that I think about Vampire Hunter D? Well, I think it's a good show. It's good entertainment. And I also like how the show uses pride and honor on both sides. You see, not only D and the good vampires within the realm, but the evil vampires within this realm use pride and honor to justify their actions. It doesn't matter which side they're on. It shows how pride and honor can be used for good and how pride and honor can be used for evil. And that I find to be interesting. At the very least, it makes for an interesting show. And that is my review of Vampire Hunter D.